begin with, let's consider the components here. Alright, we are going to start to look at the cardiovascular system, and to begin with, let's consider the components here. Right? This is how we're going to approach this unit. So within the cardiovascular system, we can begin by first considering blood, which is a connective tissue. The cardiovascular system pumps blood throughout the body. We have roughly 4.5 to 6 liters of blood, depending on the person, of course. Blood is a connective tissue. So right off the bat, what do you know? We know it has formed elements, which are cellular components, but also has mostly water and extracellular proteins, like we saw with all the other connective tissue, right? A matrix, all the extracellular components. And so we speak of blood, we're going to speak of the formed elements. This is just a rough overview. All right, that's the cellular components. And things that were cells at one point. We'll discuss platelets later. And then what's referred to as plasma. Plasma is that extracellular matrix of blood. Right? Fits, right? Why? It's just like any other connective tissue. But in blood, this is the major component. It's mostly plasma. And then within this plasma, we'll find numerous proteins and water. All right, just like any connective tissue. But we'll talk about blood separately. The pump that drives the blood through the body is the heart. We'll address that separately as well. So these are kind of the lessons we have in cardiovascular system. We'll talk about blood. We'll talk about the heart. And we have a 4-chambered heart. Not always the same for every species. And these 4 chambers act to pump blood in 2 separate circuits. We'll talk about the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit, which will lead us into a discussion of the respiratory system. Pulmonary refers to the lungs, and so the pulmonary circuit will pump blood to the lungs and back, so to pick up oxygen, drop off carbon dioxide. And the systemic circuit is then going to pump blood throughout the body and back to your nose, to your toes, and everything in between. All right, so 2 separate circuits in our cardiovascular system. And so we'll actually then address that as well. We'll first take a look at the histology of the circulatory system, so the vessels. We'll take a look at their histology. And of course, there are layers and all kinds of goodies we'll talk about as usual. Then we'll describe the types of vessels. Everything has layers in biology. And the different types of vessels we'll see are really just different derivatives of the organization of the same histology. Nature's lazy. You have, 50, 60,000 miles of blood vessels? Think about it, 50 to 60,000 miles. That's a lot of vasculature, right? Miles and miles of vessels. If you take all the vessels from a person out, you line them up end to end, you're probably going to kill the person. You shouldn't do that. I'm just kidding. I stole that joke from somebody. But the idea is, that's a lot of mileage, right? If you remove everything but the blood vessels from a person, you can still recognize the person. That's how much detail there is, right? We're mostly blood vessels. And we'll show you some examples of that. Actually, it's kind of cool. It's called corrosion casting. But they're all just derivatives of a basic archetype, right? And so once we get that, this is pretty cake, right? It's pretty much cake. And then, of course, the last step is to consider, the actual vessels themselves, right? The path of blood. And so here we'll consider the path of blood from your heart to various regions, to your lungs. That'll be the pulmonary circuit, to your brain. That's going to be an interesting story. We'll talk about something called the circle of Willis. Then we'll talk about blood supply to your hands and to your feet, to your thorax, All very, very straightforward stuff. Actually, one of the easiest lessons this semester. But the one part it gets a little bit complicated is to your abdominal viscera. Because here your liver is going to come into play. And we'll describe something called the hepatic portal system. All right. First, we'll describe what a portal system is, and hepatic refers to liver. So there's an interesting little thing happening there we'll talk about separately, but we'll build up to that as we get there. All right. In fact, this might actually save until we talk about the digestive system, because this was the point of describing blood supply to your abdominal organs and organs associated with digestion. If we haven't really talked about those organs yet, we haven't talked about the liver, why talk about blood supply to the liver? So this may be held off until the next unit. All right. Okay, so let's begin. We're going to begin with the heart. We don't always get to cover blood in this course. Blood is covered in physiology and microbiology in exhausting detail. But in anatomy, we can allude to it. But for now, let's really focus on the heart. And so we'll start our lesson on the cardiovascular system by looking at the pump for this cardiovascular system. Then we'll get into the vessels, and then time permitting, we'll come back and look at blood itself. Our heart is an interesting structure. A couple of terms that, once again, I want to clarify. When we talk about the circulatory system or the heart, a couple of terms that are critical. One is artery versus vein, the types of vessels. An artery versus a vein. Besides spelling, what's the difference? Arteries always pump blood away from the heart. That's the hard rule. Away from the heart. So blood leaving the heart, whether it's going to the pulmonary circuit or the systemic circuit, always leaves by way of an artery. Blood coming back returns by a vein. Always by a vein. Another term you may have heard, or a couple of terms you may have heard of, oxygen-rich versus oxygen-poor blood. And some people use the term oxygenated versus deoxygenated. So oxygen-rich, O2 is oxygen, right? You can refer to it as oxygenated. Oxygenated is a perfectly acceptable term, but the idea is deoxygenated blood doesn't really occur. It's never completely deoxygenated, but we can use that term as well. So oxygen-rich, oxygenated blood versus O2 poor blood, sometimes referred to as deoxygenated, which is a misnomer because it can never be completely deoxygenated. All right, so we're depleted in oxygen. O2 rich and O2 poor, oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood. And the idea is this: you can have arteries carrying oxygen-rich blood, or you can have arteries carrying oxygen-poor blood. You can have veins carrying oxygen-rich blood, and you can have veins carrying oxygen-poor blood. These are mutually exclusive terms. These are mutually exclusive categories. The next thing to consider are the circuits. There are actually two separate circuits, and I mentioned them before. We have the pulmonary circuit, which is going to pump blood from the heart to the lungs and then back, right? So when will we do this? Well, we're trying to send oxygen-poor blood by way of veins to your lungs, and oxygen-rich blood will then return by way of arteries back to your heart, right? That's the pulmonary circuit. So we're dropping off carbon dioxide, we're picking up oxygen, refreshing those respiratory gases, if you will. And then the systemic circuit, like I mentioned earlier, that's everything else. To your nose, to your toes, and everything in between, to your brain, whatever nook and cranny of the body besides the lungs. And so the systemic circuit will then have that oxygen-rich blood that just came back from the lungs, will then leave by way of an artery, pump to the systemic circuit, will drop off oxygen, will pick up carbon dioxide, and then veins will bring oxygen-poor blood, then in this case, back in the systemic circuit, back towards the heart to be pumped back again to the pulmonary circuit. So when you speak of two circuits, it's the typical illustration is something like this. Here's the heart. By the way, it's not what the heart looks like, but hey, not too bad. We'll describe where this comes from later. But the idea is, it's not two circuits like this, one in and out one side, and then one in and out the same side. The reality is it's more like this. It's more of a figure eight. It is going like a figure eight. It is going to be, we're going to leave one side and then then come in the other side, and leave one side and come in the other side. So it's like a figure eight. In one side, out the other side. In one side, out the other side. In one side, out the other side. Right? And as far as the heart goes, if we take a look at the heart, it's an interesting structure. Let's first take a look at how the heart develops, right? We have a four-chambered heart, but although I'm not going to hold you accountable for this embryology, it's interesting to consider where this comes from. Kind of highlights how the structure develops. And it's around, I don't know, roughly 21 or so days, about 3 weeks into fetal development, we have these two early precursors to our cardiovascular system, the endocardial tubes. So these early precursors to the heart called the endocardial tubes. So these two endocardial tubes, which then fuse, right? As they converge, we end up with a structure that looks something like this. And don't forget, you're not going to be held accountable for this. I just want you to see the big picture. So as they fuse, we end up with a common shared wall, right? And now we take these two endocardial tubes, right? And the flow of fluid is in one direction, right? We take these tubes and we give them a twist. We take this structure and we twist it in that direction, yeah? We twist it over, and there's no way on earth I'm going to draw this, but you guys can get it. And after we twist it, we then take the bottom portion and we fold it over. All right, and so what we get is really a structure that's, this twist I'm not going to be able to draw, but what we get coming out of the heart, we'll see everything comes in and out, in and out, in and out the top, in and out the top. Does that make sense? All four of these openings end up on top. Well, we end up with two that are, and since this is a twist, these actually end up crossing over each other because the whole structure was twisted. And so we have kind of everything leaving out the front, twisted, and then coming in from the sides across the top. In fact, when we look at the heart, the bottom of the heart, that's referred to as the apex. And if you notice, nothing comes in and out the heart in the apex, but everything comes in and out the top. And so we call the top the base. Right? The base is the top and the apex is the bottom of the heart. And all the great vessels entering the heart come in and out through the base, not the apex. And you can see why, correct? Twist this around and then fold it over on itself, and that's what we get. All the openings are along the top. Two coming in, two coming out. All right? So let's define those and let's try to illustrate them. Try being the operant term here. We have a four-chambered heart. All right, so draw a four-chambered heart. And this is the best you guys get from me today, right? Close enough. And we're divided into left and right sides and upper and lower chambers. And the upper chambers are called the atria, and the lower chambers are called the ventricles. One atrium, plural atria, and ventricle versus ventricles. The left side, this would be then the left atrium. This would be the right atrium. This down here is the left ventricle, and this up here is the right ventricle. All right, learn this schematically first, then add the details. Blood coming in to the heart from the systemic circuit. So this is going to be coming into the heart, so it's an artery or a vein. It's going to be veins. These are going to be carrying oxygen poor blood. And usually we denote oxygen poor blood using the blue color because blood has a bluish appearance when it's deprived of oxygen. Hemoglobin bound to oxygen has a reddish appearance, and then when it's oxygen poor blood has a bluish appearance. So blood comes into the right atrium by way of the vena cava. Everything above the heart, blood is delivered by way of the superior vena cava, and from below the heart, by way of the inferior vena cava. So these are the superior and the inferior vena cava, carrying blood into the right atrium. From the right atrium, blood will pass to the right ventricle. We'll describe that process in way more detail later. And then the right ventricle will pump the blood out to the, think about this, came in from the systemic circuit, think of that figure 8, and it's going to go out to the pulmonary circuit. Right. I'll illustrate it like this. And so leaving the heart, this is leaving the right ventricle. This is actually going to come off, and it's going to branch into the left and right. Now think about it. This is leaving the heart, going to the left and right lungs, and this is going to be therefore the left and right, going to the lungs, so pulmonary arteries. Right? Left and right pulmonary arteries, remember, are away from the heart. And this little stretch right here, actually before it branches to left and right, it's called the pulmonary trunk. Before it branches, right? We see that term quite often when we talk about circulation. The pulmonary trunk, branching left and right pulmonary arteries. Okay? Coming back from the heart, blood is going to return to the, where is it going to come back to? Always into the atrium. So it's going to come back into the left atrium. In this case, it's coming from the lungs, carrying oxygen-rich blood, hence the red color. So this is going to be coming from the lungs. This is the pulmonary. This is going to be back towards the heart. So these are the pulmonary veins, left and right. And so coming back here, I'm just going to draw it this far, and then it kind of continues on all the way back there, coming into the left atrium from the right side and from the left side. These are the pulmonary veins. Okay? Into the left atrium. From there, blood will pass into the left ventricle. Left ventricle will contract. And in this case, it's going to pump blood out. It's going to pass behind the pulmonary trunk. And then it will leave your left oxygen-rich blood. Will then travel up and out the aorta, which is your largest artery, carrying oxygen-rich blood, in this case, oxygenated blood out of the left ventricle, right? And then onto the systemic circuit there, and then it comes back by way of the superior and inferior vena cava once again, all right? So be familiar with this circuit first. Before you go any further, be comfortable with this, all right? And then let's talk a little bit about the organization and the histology of the heart. Remember, ogres have layers, onions have layers. Well, guess what? So does your heart. The majority of the mass of the wall of the heart is a layer of cardiac muscle called the myocardium. All right, and that's going to be cardiac muscle. Remember, striated muscle. So striated muscle, what do we know? We know that there's sarcomeres. We know that there's A bands and I bands and actin and myosin. The control of it is a little bit different. Where the calcium comes from is a little bit different than skeletal muscle, but you know so much just by knowing cardiac muscle is striated, correct? All right. Well, then lining the myocardium, a really important feature here. There's going to be a layer of tissue called the endocardium. Now, this is going to be kind of critical for several things here, all right? So lining the inside, the chamber of the heart, this is the endocardium. But a little bit about the endocardium. There are two components. It's lined with simple squamous epithelium, right? If it's a hollow space, the chamber, the ventricle, or the atrium of the heart, it's going to be epithelium. It's simple squamous, which makes sense because blood vessels are also lined with simple squamous epithelium. And so, since this developed from blood vessels, it makes perfect sense. All All right, simple squamous epithelium forming the endocardium. But really important feature. A lot of books will make a big deal of this epithelium. I want you to remember one more thing. Epithelium can never exist by itself. Epithelium is always supported by connective tissue. In this case, the layer of, you ready for this? Dense irregular connective tissue. Yes, our good friend once again is back. And boy, is that going to be a major player here. That's an important idea. All right, so pay attention to that. So it's epithelium, yes, but it's supported by a layer of dense irregular connective tissue. On the outside, on the periphery of the heart, we'll find yet another layer. Now here, there's a couple names for this layer. It depends on your point of view. We've actually already seen this before. It's referred to as the epicardium. I'm going to draw it out like so, or attempt to anyways. This is the epicardium. Epi is on top. But remember what we said? We said that serous membranes cover the heart, cover the lungs, and cover your abdominal viscera. And so in this case, the epicardium is the visceral pericardium. It's the same thing. And now you know everything about it because you know what the pericardium is like. You know the pericardium has simple squamous epithelium supported by areolar tissue, right? Just like every serous membrane. And it folds on itself, forming that double membrane, right? Forming the space in between the two, right? This is the serous cavity or the pericardial space. And then this layer out here, that's going to be the parietal pericardium. But interestingly, the pericardium is not attached to the body wall. It's like it's a fiber sac surrounding the heart. So we need to support, this is just a layer of simple squamous epithelium. We need to back it up with something. So guess what we have supporting that parietal pericardium? You got it, another layer of dense irregular connective tissue. The layer is called the fibrous pericardium. So once again, the endocardium is a layer of simple squamous epithelium but supported by some dense irregular connective tissue. So there's a barrier of dense irregular connective tissue here. Myocardium is striated muscle, cardiac muscle, which we'll talk about in just a second, a little bit more detail. You'll get in crazy detail in physiology. The pericardium consists of two layers, the parietal and the visceral pericardium, and the visceral pericardium is just the epicardium. And then supporting the parietal pericardium is a layer of dense irregular connective tissue called the fibrous pericardium. And so if you dissect a heart, the heart sits inside this tough fibrous sac. That's primarily the fibrous pericardium, all right, with a fluid-filled space in between. And here you can see that. Almost as pretty of a picture as what I drew. All right. We see the endocardium, right? The endocardium is just that thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, but it's supported by dense irregular connective tissue. There is the mass of the wall of the heart, the myocardium. Here is the visceral layer of the pericardium, also known as the epicardium. The pericardial cavity or space, which is just a serous cavity filled with serous fluid. And then over here, there's the parietal pericardium, supported by a layer of dense irregular connective tissue called the fibrous pericardium. Right? Important terms to know. This will come back to haunt us, especially this endocardium, especially that dense irregular connective tissue supporting it. So just quickly, let's recap that path of blood through the chambers of the heart. All right, everything we're going to talk about is going to be synchronized to this. Two ideas kind of tie everything together. One is this path from the two circuits, right? In one side, out the other. So blood coming in by way of the vena cava is going to come in to the right atrium, pass to the right ventricle, and leave the right ventricle on its way up to the lungs. Blood is going to come back to the left atrium and then be pumped out by the left ventricle to return to the right side. So it's out the left, into the right, out the right, into the left, Yeah, and then repeat over and over again. There's that figure 8. That's part 1. Part 2, we're going to talk about contraction of the chambers. Might as well start thinking about this. The chambers contract. It's cardiac muscle. As they contract, they can pump blood. And so when the atria contract, they're going to pump blood into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, they're going to pump blood into the arteries. But one thing has to happen. If these chambers contract, they also have to relax. And so the synchronization in this is atria contract. Before anything else happens, the atria must relax. Seems almost too simple, but that's a really important idea to keep in mind. That's going to synchronize everything. Once that's done, then the ventricles contract. And then the ventricles relax. Right? And then we repeat. And this sequence has to be followed. Anything throwing this off can cause major problems. All right. So remember, atria contract, atria relax, ventricles contract, ventricles relax. We're going to make a really complicated story, but it's going to be based on these two simple ideas, in one side out the other, and this pattern of contraction relaxation. All right. So get comfortable with this before you get into the next lesson.